The warning didn't start with headlines or government reports. It started with silence. In Toyota's massive Kentucky plant, the machines still run, but the energy is different. Workers notice empty spots on the line. Shipments that used to arrive like clockwork are now delayed. The Lexus line has stopped, the RAV4 line has slowed, and the whole ecosystem around the factory feels the drop. Small suppliers are trimming shifts. Truckers are waiting for calls that never come. This slowdown wasn't caused by falling demand or a weak market. It began with a policy that promised to bring jobs home. Instead, it set off a chain reaction that's now reshaping an entire industry. And as the pressure builds in the United States, another country is quietly taking the lead. To see how this shift began, we need to look at the first cracks inside the factory itself. Toyota's Georgetown plant has always been more than a factory. For years, it was a symbol of steady work in Kentucky, a place where production rarely slowed and entire towns built their routines around its schedule. That rhythm is now breaking. Inside the plant, once full lines are pausing. Some sections run below capacity. Workers describe a feeling that something fundamental has shifted. Around the factory, the impact becomes even clearer. Small suppliers that fed Toyota for decades are cutting hours and sending people home early. Machine shops that ran late into the night are now closing before sunset. Truckers who once hauled constant shipments say they can go days without a call. Local cafes and service shops are seeing fewer customers, a sign that paychecks in the area are thinning. Nothing in the market explains this sudden slowdown. Demand for popular models like the RAV4 hasn't collapsed, and the broader auto sector wasn't facing a natural downturn. The pressure came from outside the factory walls, from national policy that reshaped costs and supply routes almost overnight. What started as a quiet shift inside one plant is now spreading outward, and the forces behind it are about to become impossible to ignore. The pressure on Toyota wasn't happening in isolation. It began the moment the White House announced a sweeping 25% tariff on imported cars and auto parts earlier this year. The move came with bold language and a clear promise: bring manufacturing back home and make it American again. For many, it sounded like the start of a new industrial revival. But once the policy took effect, the real impact hit fast. Automakers operating in the United States were suddenly facing nearly $18 billion in new costs within the first year alone. That shock rippled through every part of the industry. Production across North America dropped by more than 20,000 vehicles per day, a 30% fall within a single month. Companies built around tight schedules and thin margins couldn't keep up with the new expenses. Global brands reacted quickly. Volvo, Audi, Mercedes-Benz, and Hyundai began scaling back their American operations or shifting certain lines to countries outside the tariffs' reach. Plants that once planned expansions started freezing hiring. The companies that stayed had only one way to absorb the sudden rise in costs: raise prices. Within weeks, the average price of a new car in the United States broke past $50,000 for the first time, putting ownership even further out of reach for middle-class families. The policy meant to revive American factories instead made them more expensive to operate. Every imported bolt, chip, battery pack, and transmission suddenly cost more. That increase didn't just hit automakers. It moved through the entire supply chain and onto showroom floors. For many companies, the math no longer worked. For many families, the dream of a new car faded. While factories across the U.S. were tightening budgets and slowing production, another country watched the disruption closely and moved with a very different strategy. While American factories struggled with rising costs and shrinking output, Canada moved in a very different direction. Instead of tightening its borders or adding new barriers, Ottawa focused on stability. The message to global automakers was clear: long-term planning, predictable rules, and support for major investments. That calm approach immediately stood out in a moment when companies everywhere were searching for certainty. Honda was the first to act. The company announced a record $15 billion investment to build a massive electric vehicle and battery complex in Ontario. It was the largest project Honda had ever committed to in Canada. Backed by nearly $5 billion in combined federal and provincial incentives, The site is expected to create around 4,000 jobs and reach an annual output of roughly 240,000 EVs and 36 gigawatt-hours of batteries by 2028. Toyota followed the same path. Instead of expanding inside the United States, it increased its footprint in Ontario, taking advantage of Canada's broad trade access. Under agreements like the CPTPP and USMCA, Canadian-built vehicles can move freely into more than 50 global markets without the tariff walls now surrounding the U.S. auto industry. This shift didn't happen by accident. Canada centered its Made in Canada strategy on clean energy, long-term investment, and consistent policy. In an era filled with supply chain shocks and political uncertainty, predictability itself became a competitive advantage. As global automakers moved northward, the contrast with the United States grew sharper, and the company that felt those differences most clearly was Toyota. For Toyota, the cost of the tariff shock became clear faster than almost anyone expected. The company entered 2025 in a strong position, but within months, its global earnings fell by nearly $9.5 billion, the sharpest drop in the entire industry. The hit was even more severe in North America. For years, Toyota's operations in the region had been reliable profit makers. By the first quarter of 2025, that changed. The division swung from profit to loss as the new tariffs pushed expenses toward $3 billion. Executives reviewed the numbers and lowered the company's annual profit forecast by 16%. They pointed to three forces working against them: shrinking demand, higher material costs, and a supply chain that no longer functioned smoothly. Plants that once ran around the clock began working shorter schedules. Some sections paused. Others reduced production goals. The slowdown didn't stop at the factory gates. Suppliers that depended on Toyota's stable orders started cutting shifts. In towns built around auto production, small machine shops and logistics firms began to feel the drop in work. Jobs weren't disappearing all at once, but they were drifting, many of them toward Canada, where new investments and cleaner energy costs made production more predictable. Inside Toyota, the shift was viewed as a warning. A company known for precision and resilience was facing mounting pressure simply to keep operations steady. And if Toyota was struggling on this scale, the rest of the industry was headed for deeper trouble. The pressure on Toyota signaled something larger happening across the entire auto sector. The U.S. supply chain, already stretched, began to break under the weight of higher costs. Nearly 40% of the value of a vehicle assembled in America comes from imported components. Every one of those parts, engines, chips, wiring harnesses, battery modules, was suddenly more expensive. The rise in material prices pushed the strain even further. Steel, aluminum, and copper climbed between 18% and 40%. That alone added roughly $3,000 to the cost of building each car in the United States. For many small and mid-sized suppliers, there was no way to absorb that increase. More than 500 parts manufacturers suspended operations or shut down temporarily, unable to keep up with the surge in expenses. Even the industry's biggest players felt the squeeze. Ford and General Motors trimmed their domestic output by up to 10% this year, citing material shortages and rising logistics costs. Auto haulers, who depend on steady production to survive, reported the weakest shipment volumes in over 15 years. What began as a pricing decision in Washington had now worked its way through every stage of the industry, from metals to parts to assembly to transportation. And as businesses struggled to adapt, another battle was unfolding far from the factory floor, inside the highest court in the country. As factories struggled and suppliers closed their doors, the fight over tariffs shifted to a very different arena: the Supreme Court. A coalition of small American businesses, from toy makers to wine importers, filed a lawsuit arguing that the president's tariffs were unconstitutional. They said the policy forced them to lay off workers, cut production, and even sell products at a loss just to stay alive. Two lower courts agreed with them. The Court of International Trade ruled that President Trump lacked the legal authority to impose these tariffs, pointing to the Constitution, which gives Congress the power to regulate trade. The Federal Circuit Court of Appeals upheld that ruling, setting the stage for a national showdown. Inside the Supreme Court, the skepticism was evident. Chief Justice John Roberts noted that the IEEPA, the law the administration relied on, doesn't mention tariffs at all. Justice Elena Kagan pointed out that the statute lists many presidential powers, yet none describe what Trump was trying to do. Even Justice Amy Coney Barrett, appointed by Trump, questioned why allies like Spain and France were targeted the same way as rivals. The financial stakes are huge. U.S. customs data shows that IEE EPA-based tariffs have generated nearly $90 billion for the Treasury. If the court rules against the administration, businesses could seek refunds, a process trade lawyers warn might take years to organize. This case isn't only about trade rules. It could redefine how much economic power a president can use without Congress. And whatever the outcome, the ripple effects will reach far beyond the courtroom. The Supreme Court battle will shape future policy, but the effects of the tariffs are already redrawing the industrial map of North America. As companies adjust to rising costs and unpredictable rules in the United States, analysts warn that the country could lose up to 25% of its entire auto supply chain by 2030. That shift is not theoretical. It is already underway, and the destination is clear. Canada has positioned itself as the natural landing spot. With long-term incentives, steady regulations, and broad trade access, it offers what many automakers now need most: predictability. Industry forecasts show Canada is on track to capture as much as 40% of the region's electric vehicle and battery production capacity within the same period. New factories, research centers, and battery plants in places like Ontario and Windsor form a growing ecosystem that continues to attract fresh investment. This isn't happening through aggressive rhetoric or headline-grabbing moves. It's a slow buildup of strategy, clean energy, and consistent industrial planning. Each new project strengthens the next, creating a network designed to last decades. In contrast, U.S. manufacturers are facing higher material costs, disrupted supply routes, and shifting political priorities. Companies are finding it harder to plan long-term, and the hesitation shows in hiring freezes, reduced output, and delayed expansions. The result is a quiet migration of industrial power, one shaped less by dramatic announcements and more by steady decisions made over months and years. And as this shift accelerates, the future of North American manufacturing is beginning to look very different from what Washington originally promised. A policy meant to protect American jobs is now sending them across the border. Canada built a strategy that attracts long-term investment, while the United States built barriers that slowed its own industry. And the impact is spreading far beyond auto plants, into supply chains, small businesses, and even the courts. Can the U.S. still change course? Or is North America's industrial future already shifting for good? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe to stay tuned for more global economic shifts. See you in the next one.